Okay. I hope everyone can hear me and understand me. That would be good. Okay, works fine. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So then let's start the session. First, thank you all for coming. It's nice that you could join and nice that you are here. I'm in London currently, so greetings from London. And I hope you have a good time. Feel free to ask questions as you see in the question chat, and we will go back to the chat once in a while while we're presenting. Okay, sounds good. Let's start. Okay, so well, I'm here to talk about Agile, as you know. And Agile is something that is, well, very discussed, especially in the DevOps community. And I want to talk about Agile today a bit and what impact it has on the community and how you can actually use that in order to boost your productivity and everything. But first, let me start with a little story. Let me start by telling you a little story. And as it is with stories, all stories start, of course, with the best intentions, right? All stories start with great intentions, and so does this. So let's imagine, you're currently in an office, and you're just waiting on like your manager to join your meeting, where he tries to evaluate you, and then he comes in and says, "Well, I want to do Agile," and well, you're kind of happy, right? Because you read it in a paper somewhere, you read some articles regarding Agile in the magazine, and it sounds all great, right? But more productivity, more self-empowerment, and everything else. So you say, well, why don't we just start with it? And how do we start with it, right? And your manager says, well, that's great that you're so enthusiastic about it because you read it everywhere. So we will start by using Scrum. And then there's this little word but. And this but is in my journey as an agile coach in different organizations, this is something I hear a lot. But, and this is in this story. There is a but as well, and well, the but actually describes something that's called letting things out of the equation, right? So, well, he starts and says, well, let's do Scrum, but I think we skip the retrospectives. And you say, well, why should we skip the retrospectives? They are very important, right? And he says, well, I don't want to talk. I want you to talk about your feelings. This is no psychotherapy, and we want to be more productive, right? Agile means more productive and more and faster. We are faster when we use retrospectives. So let's skip that. And you say, okay, well, and then your manager says, well, let's skip the planning as well. And well, you are wondering why. And he says, well, I read somewhere that agile always means like being active and being chaotic and changing something. And so we don't need plans, right? We can go. And if I want something, you do it. So that's my definition. So we don't plan. And maybe we skip the dailies as well because, well, you have a chat. I can call you whenever I want, and you can chat whenever you want. So why should we have dailies? And maybe we could skip sprints as well because, well, we can release whenever we want, maybe in 2 years and 4 years. So we don't need these sprints. I just tell you what to do, and then you do it. And now we're agile because we're using Scrum. This is something that I actually encountered a lot when looking at organizations that want to have agile practices implemented. And in the end, the manager that wants to implement Scrum then goes and says, well, agile fails. It's failed. We don't need it anymore. And so it's great because, well, the productivity that were promised to me is not existing. My customers are not satisfied as they should be because we are agile now. And of course, the engaged team members, the motivated team members that Agile should bring are not there. They are demotivated because they get to be promised something, but the promise fails. So Agile is failing. This is something that you read a lot and that I saw a lot, especially in bigger companies. And for me, the reason for that lies in how to start with looking at Agile. So let me back up a bit. So when you think about practices and methods and how they are created, it always starts with a mindset, right? Or values. So something that is hard to describe and even harder to do, because I can say to you, well, bravery is a value I expect from you, but maybe you cannot see how bravery translates into something practical. So you create principles that actually describe what this bravery means. For example, a principle for bravery could be face your fears, right? So face your fears. If you face your fears, if you try to act after that principle, then you're brave. And from that principle, you can create actions. For example, myself, I'm quite afraid of roller coasters, to be honest. So one action could be that I would just drive in roller coasters for 1 month. So this could be a practice I could do. And if I have many of those practices, I can combine them into methods. So practices are basically actions that are translated from principles, directly linked to them. And methods are just a collection of practices. And more often than not, companies start at the method. So if they want to do Agile, they want to do Scrum or Kanban, but they don't know why the methods actually link to the principles and how they are linked together. And this is, in my opinion, why many companies fail to implement Agile, because they actually don't get why this method or this practice, for example, the retrospective, is used in Scrum. And what I want to do today is to actually go from the principles on and try to create or try to find practices that promise to be actions that are created from the principles and that enact the principles. And from there on, we can discuss methods. So this is what I want to do today and why I'm here. So this is my talk. Welcome. I hope you enjoyed the introduction. And just heads up, I said we talk about 12 Agile Essentials because there are 12 principles, but today we will only talk about 6 because that is a DevOps conference and I only have 40 minutes. So we will only talk about 6 principles. Yeah, so I'm Jan. I'm from Germany. I'm currently staying in London, as you know. And I'm an Agile coach, which basically, in my opinion, is someone who likes to implement Agile practices, but just does not just look at, let's say, Scrum, because Scrum Masters are very focused on their method. But there was a great description, like someone a Scrum Master who is like interested in more than their own methods are Agile coaches. So I would describe myself as an Agile coach. I'm a football lover. I really love football, the European, let's say, football. I'm a tech enthusiast. I develop in my free time. I was a developer before I became an Agile coach, and I'm a very loyal and faithful gamer. Yes. So before we dive into the Agile practices, we have a bit of theory to cover. So we have to look at what Agile actually is, because this is something that many people that, for example, try to book consulting at our firm always ask us, well, what is Agile actually? And there are many definitions going around, and you can find definitions that suit your needs, but I have a kind of a different definition, and I found mine when looking at someone who actually went to the summit, because at the summit, this Agile manifesto was actually created, and the word Agile was used. And one of these participants were Robert C. Martin, and he just tweeted that Agile is just a name, and it beat out lightweight and adaptive, which is quite interesting to me, because anyone who is like working on Agile stuff always says, well, we have to do Agile development. It would have been fun if you just call it lightweight development, which would make more sense, I guess. I don't know, but we are here now. So Agile is just a name. And this is an interesting definition to me, because for me, it describes basically what Agile actually is. Agile, and this is something I want you to take away, in my opinion, is a name for a set of principles, nothing more. So it's a box. So it isn't like something that is difficult to understand, because it's in its center is just a name for some principles, right? And it's nothing magical. It's nothing you have to study abroad for to learn. And it's not something that you find somewhere, or it's nothing that like you can interpret many things on. And especially, it is not Scrum. And this is a distinction. I just want to distinguish this. So Scrum is not Agile. Agile is something, and Scrum tries to implement the principles that are in this Agile atmosphere. But Agile is not Scrum. I just want to emphasize that, because many companies I found are always try to see Agile and Scrum as a synonym. Scrum has practices that try to implement the Agile principles, but it's a method in itself. It's not Agile. Okay, so let's take that out of the way. So we think for Agile, we think Agile as a name for just a set of principles. So we have to now look at the principles to get going and get to the practical part, and take a look at what practices we actually can apply. So there are 12 Agile principles. To name 3, for example, the first principle, which says we have to develop with the customer in mind, to get feedback as fast as possible and to release as fast as possible. The last principle, the 12th one, to reflect always like in intervals, to reflect our action in certain intervals. And the 7th one, which says that working software is the primary measurement of progress. So there are many different principles, 12 in fact, and I try to cluster them after certain topics, after a certain context that they actually fit in. So for me, there are 3 contexts that actually work when it comes to Agile. So the first context is the customer centricity. So 4 of these principles are very clear. And for example, the first one, we want to place the customer in the center of our development. So everything that we develop for the customer. So this is customer centricity. These are the principles that we don't focus on today, because they are very like product and very product focused, and we want to look at the technical stuff. The second thing, I called it learning habits. Is a very difficult name for me to find, to be honest. It's focusing on like reflecting and finding the strength to actually adapt and inspect and adapt your actions. And there are different principles for that as well. For example, the 12th one, as I just told you, that are focusing on learning habits. So to get into a habit of learning things. And the third one is the one we want to focus on today. And this is the continuous releases. Continuous releases means we want to release things continuously in a certain pace. And there are 4 of these principles, of these Agile principles, that we want to look at more closely, that actually focus on releasing software or any other product in a constructed manner. So if you think of it as like, let's say, a form, you could think of it as a triangle. So you have the customer centricity, you have the continuous releases, and you have learning habits. And if you play all 3, so if you try to apply practices to all 3 contexts, you then can like deliver the promise of Agile that I showed before, like more productivity, more engaged customers and everything. But you can also start on one context with the practices and move then to other ones, right? You always have to see what you actually need, because Agile has its promises, but maybe it's enough that you start having learning habits, or start to release continuously, or to be more customer centristic. So it depends on what you actually want. And this is why I very much urge you to consult the Agile Manifesto when you try to work out how you want to be Agile. Because the Agile Manifesto contains the principles, and the principles have to be upheld, as we saw, in order for the mindset to set in. So we think that if we start the practices and work on the practices, then we are upholding the principles, and by upholding the principles, we want to be Agile because we live the values and have the mindset. So this is the theoretic groundwork for the theoretic part. So I want to see if you already have some questions regarding this, but I don't see any questions. So this looks good so far. Okay. So let's go back. There aren't any questions, so I would just continue there. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A tab, and then we can talk to each other while working. Okay, great. So let's get started with the practical part of this whole presentation. As I said, we want to try to actually map the principles, the Agile principles, to the Agile practices, and then maybe find methods that contain many of these practices. So we want to basically make the jump from the principles to the practices. So what I want to do now is to go through each Agile principle that we look in depth today and just present you with 3 or 2 practices that actually implement these principles, so that you have a direction you can go to when you think about actually implementing these practices. And let me start with the learning habits, because even though we want to focus on continuous releases today, the learning habit part is quite important in my opinion, because learning habits are very important to get right when you start working with everything. It's kind of the basis of everything. You want to inspect and adapt your practices and things you work on, especially when you try them out, right? So learning habits are important. And for me, no principle describes that better than the 12th principle of the Agile Manifesto, which basically tells you to reflect in a regular interval to be more effective. And for me, there are 3 practices that I saw in my time that actually try to implement this. It's the retrospective, obviously, the Johari feedback, and the happiness meter. The happiness meter, I will not get into that deep, because it's basically just a survey to see if your actions actually have an impact on your well-being or on the well-being of the team. But it's a very interesting method. Just Google it to actually measure how productive and how happy the team is in order to learn, right? Okay, let's talk about retrospectives. Retrospectives basically are a format or a meeting that you can actually use to inspect and adapt your practices and everything you do. So in Scrum, usually it takes after every sprint, you try to look at the last sprint to check if something bad happened or something good happened, and you have to look into what you did good and what you didn't do that well. So you try to balance it basically, right? And you try to find actions, and this is quite important. You try to find actions that you actually can implement. So when you look at retrospectives, you gather data, you generate insights into what you actually did and why you did it the way you did, and then try to decide what to do in order to get things working again, or maybe to start doing things more because they work so well, right? So this is retrospectives. Retrospectives, in my opinion, are very important because they are an event that you can use to reflect your behavior, which basically is the promise that the 12th Agile principle actually gives. So this is one practice that I recommend you doing. The second one I want to talk about is the Johari feedback. And this is something very personal. So when you look at reflection starts at the actions of the team and the, let's say, professional actions, the business actions. But often you find yourself going towards yourself. So to things that you actually did, or to things that move you or that impact you. And what the hard feedback does well, in my opinion, is to actually make these things transparent. So if you work with other people in your team, at some point it could happen that conflicts arise, because of course conflicts will arise when you have to make decisions for yourselves, right? So to actually get why you decide something in a way, and to get to know you better, the Johari window can actually help in order to make your needs and make your habits more transparent, and to make yourself transparent what others think of you. So it works that way, that you have a self-evaluation and evaluation from others, and then you move them into these 4 windows. And especially blind spot and hidden self are very interesting, because the hidden self is something that others don't know about you, or others couldn't know about you because you didn't tell them. And the blind spot is something that you haven't seen. For example, I talk very loudly, and this was feedback to me, and I didn't notice because, for example, I did not hear that. And these are things that regularly done, it's quite helpful to get to know each other, but also to understand each other better and understand the decision that we want to take better, right? So these are learning habits that try to promote the reflecting side of things. If you now look at the learning habits from a different kind of way, for example, from the self-organizing way, there are practices that can help you self-organize better. There are, for example, the tactical and the daily. Tactical is something out of the holacracy framework, but it basically means the same. So you have a meeting in daily that you try to synchronize. But what I want to talk about now is the delegation poker. And this is, I think, a more interesting thing, because when you are a self-organizing team, you have to make decisions. And that is not easy, because you always have to think about, well, what impact does my decision have on others? And how fast should the decision go, and so on. And more often than not, you think about, well, who has to make the decision? And the delegation program for management 3.0 actually helps you and your stakeholders to identify, well, what decisions should we make and what decisions should we delegate. So you can try to think of decisions that you have to make in an agile team. And then you can think, well, should I just make the decision and inform everyone? Or should I delegate the decision to someone because I think he is more responsible, or he is the one that gets impacted the most? So this is a great and neat way to think about decisions, especially decision theory, something that is very important when you are self-organizing, because when you're self-organizing, you will make a lot of decisions, and to make them right and to get the scope of the decision right is quite important. And delegation poker is a great practice to actually practice that. Yeah. So these are learning habits. I just presented some of the practices, but they all can help you to achieve what you want, to get further with what you want to do, especially when you think about creating habits of reflecting. And now we go to the technical part. We now go to the continuous releases, and I want to look at all 4 of the principles that I ordered into this cluster. And the first principle is working software is the primary measure of progress, and this is, of course, one of the most important ones. So you don't measure progress by just looking at some milestones. You measure progress by what has changed in the software. And there are 3 practices for me that are instrumental to implementing this. And this is continuous integration, user stories, and customer review. Let's start with the continuous integration. So I think you know this, but it's very important to just say it because it applies to this. It applies to this practice, to this principle. So when you develop something, you commit it, right? You have a version control system in general, so you commit something. And the question that continuous integration asks is this commit, this change that you made, is this integratable into your software, and can it be released? So what continuous integration tries to do is to actually check that and give you feedback, so that this feedback can actually be integrated into your general life cycle, and you can start over, or you can fix some things so that you can do it all over again. So if you commit something, then automatically something is built and tested. And if it works, well, it's fine. Then it can be automatically integrated into the software that you already have. But if it does not work, then you get feedback, and then you can develop it further. And ideally, this integration happens at every commit. So everything that you build is actually ready for release. And this is what work is the measurement, a primary measure of progress means. So when you try to create something, you actually are sure that this is integratable. So it's important, in my opinion, that if it's integrated, you get feedback as well. But most CI tools do that. So this is just an idea of how this practice of continuous integration works. Now, this is maybe a head scratcher for some, but for me, user stories are quite important when it comes to measurement of progress, because when you look at software and what you want to develop, you look, especially in the agile way, when you look at customer centricity, you look at the value of things. So you don't try to, most often you don't try to make a button green because it's green, but you have to think about what value does this bring to the customer. So user stories and implementing user stories are a great way to make your progress transparent. So for me, user stories have always three parts. The first part obviously is the value proposition. So the customer, from his point of view, has to say, well, what do I want in order to achieve something, right? And what the achievable thing is actually the value. So the first thing in the user story is a value proposition. The second one is a metric. So it says, well, how does this story, or how should the story affect, once it's completed, how does it affect the software, or how does it affect your behavior, right? So, for example, you have more engagement in some areas of your app or something else, right? So you try to formulate a hypothesis, let's say, a value proposition, and then try to think about metrics that like can describe, that objectify the impact of your value. And the last one, obviously, is a business value, so that you can actually think about how valuable this user story actually is. And for me, it's a great way to make your progress in software development, and make your progress while developing software transparent. So for me, it also falls under this category. And the third one, obviously, is our customer reviews. So if you want to measure progress, you have to go to someone who's interested in your progress, and this is basically the customer. So you have to have customer reviews, in my opinion. And in general, they are separated in three parts. You first have a feedback, so the customers actually can try the software you build, because you have continuously integrated it, so to make sure that it's stable and everything. And then they get feedback of that. Then you have to look at the metrics of the value propositions of the user stories to see, well, did it actually work? Did the things that I thought about actually work? And have they had the impact that I promised myself? And the last one is, of course, collaboration, because the customer review should be a meeting where you should ask yourself where to go from here. And this should not be something that is like, you do that, you do this, like the manager in the beginning said, but it should be something collaboratively that you all can agree on, right? So this is generally the idea for that. So let's focus on the next principle, which is basically deliver software frequently. And you have three different types of, for me, three different types of practices that can help you with that. Let's start with feature toggles. Feature toggles are, in my opinion, a great way to actually release frequently in a certain rhythm, because releasing does not mean that you have to build an actual physical release and to deploy it, but you have a JSON file, for example, that contains feature flags that you can switch on and off. So if you are on production and, for example, the shopping basket is not available right now, you just can click on the feature switch that toggles it on, and then it's available for everyone. So it's a silent release without needing any any deploying or something like that, and it can like boost your confidence in releasing, because you can just flip a switch and then it's on. So you have more control over what to release and whatnot. And you could, for example, also integrate an experimental switch where you said, well, I create an A/B test where 50% of my users are actually looking at the feature and the other 50% do not. So you can start experimenting and you can start to get feedback as fast as possible, which is a great way to develop and to release continuously, to get like the motivation and to get the confidence. The second one is a bit of a like, let's say, construct in a theoretical construct. But maybe when you look at features and look at stories, try to think of them experiments, right? To try to make them as short as possible. You have a hypothesis, right? So you have a theory that could work, but you have to test it. So you have to build an MVP, for example, a small increment of your software to test it. And then you analyze and observe what the users think. And then you conclude if it was right or not, and then you adapt. So think of your software, think of your features more as experiments and not as big features like login and everything. So on, try to build small MVPs in order to get the feedback as fast as possible and to adjust, right? So this is something that can help continuous releases because it's small. It has not the heavy impact that you think. It has a small impact, but it is fast to develop and can help you grow your confidence in releasing software. And the third one is quite an obvious one as well, especially when you're a developer. It's the thing called pairing. And pairing has different methods. The idea is that you don't code alone, but with others of your kind, and you can work together on software. You can do it as driver navigator. One tells one codes and the other tells the coding one what to do. You can do code reviews where two people just review code that they wrote and or that other people wrote to get a better understanding of things. Because if you have a better understanding of things, you get more confident. And if you get more confident, the results will be better and you can release more frequently. And the third one is obviously mob programming. You can all lock yourself in a room and start implementing. It's a great way to actually share knowledge and get more confident in yourself. So the third one, and second to last, basically, principle I want to look at describes sustainable development. So the Agile principle actually says that you want to have a constant pace indefinitely. And let's say one thing that is obvious that Scrum applies as well is you implement in an iterative way. You don't have like this big like requirements book that says you have to do this in 3 years, but you develop in 2-week cycles, for example. You plan your 2 weeks, you do it, you check if everything went well, you try to reflect, and then you act out what you think could be better, and you create actions that you can act on, and then start influencing the planning again. So you try to develop iteratively in order for you to get more confident, to shorten the time for release, to get more feedback, and to be faster on the market. So time to market shrinks a lot, and you want to be more at the customer. You want to close the distance between yourself and the customer, and you can achieve that by creating short iterations. The second thing for me is to actually hold stakeholder meetings. So you have sponsors, you have users, and they all have an interest in the product you build. So for me, you should have to go to them and try to include them into your planning and into things you do. So for me, a stakeholder meeting maybe once a month is great to actually try to influence the product with them and to get them on board in order to make the decisions together. So for me, a stakeholder meeting always looks back at what happened and how your goal-oriented roadmap, for example, or your goals for the next iterations are looking and how the metrics are looking. Then you try to see what went good and what went bad and how to improve that. And then together you try to plan what happens next. So you interview them, try to look at what the actual value propositions they have are, and try to prioritize them in order to get them included into what you are doing. And the last principle I want to talk about today is the ninth principle, which, let's be honest, most of us here are developers, and developers want to focus on one thing, and this is technical excellence. And the Agile Manifesto actually describes this in one principle as well. So technical excellence and good design enhances agility. And we want to have practices that actually focus on that. And three great practices for me are the community of practice, the refactoring, and enabler features. So let's look at the community of practice. So a community of practice, in my opinion, is a group of people who care about a certain domain, for example, development or UI or UX, and try to reflect in a meeting or two how they practice these things, like how they develop stuff, how they integrate stuff, how they are designing stuff, and try to improve the practices they actually use, right? So the community of practice is something that you can apply to learning habits as well. You try to reflect on the practices you're using, and with that, you try to achieve that you can actually, let's say, better yourselves and better the practices you have, get more confidence, be more productive in order to be just better in everything. So community of practice can actually help you with that. The second thing, obviously, is refactoring. I don't have to tell you this, I bet, but refactoring is a great way to actually look at software and try to make it more excellent, because software is something that needs to be enhanced in general. But I don't talk about fixing bugs. I talk about really enhancing the architecture. And there is a great site with many refactoring practices called Refactoring Guru. You should definitely check that out. But my three highlights were composing methods. So basically the idea of integrating methods into each other to create a better workflow. Moving features between objects, so you have a stable architecture with different layers. So you can basically look at the layers and see how they work together. And this third thing is organizing data. Obviously, you have to create a comprehensive data model in order to get what you want, and to enable the software to develop more features on, because it's basically like, if you don't try to mow your lawn or something, then it will grow so much that you don't have the time anymore. So this is very important when looking at software. And the last one actually comes from SAFe, and I really like this one. It's called enabler features. So SAFe actually says, well, we know that you want to make features, but it's very important to really look at the different practices and to look at the software and try to keep it healthy. So focus on the technical health of your software. And there are different ways to do that. You could try to create user stories of enabler features that focus on exploration. So you see a new technology and try to look at that and want to see if it impacts your technical health in any positive way. You could try to completely change the architecture, because you think if you change the architecture, then it's able to hold more features together. You could, of course, look at infrastructure, like in DevOps, for example, to improve the one DevOps script that you always wanted to improve. And of course, you could check compliance and look at how security could be improved in your project in order to make your releases and your software more stable. So these were a lot of practices, I know, but just a small takeaways at the end. In general, a great colleague of mine, Ulrich, always says, start something small that's safe enough to try. You can Google these practices everywhere. You can find them everywhere. I don't have to tell you that. But what I want to tell you is that you should always start small. You should always try to experiment. You should have interest in experimenting, because then you're learning. So when you try to implement practices, always start small so that they are safe enough to try. And the last one, obviously, I think I hope I could show you that. Always inspect and adapt your practices. It's very important you sharpen your blade and to always look at, are your practices in sync with the actual Agile manifesto? Then you can use methods like Scrum because you know why these methods actually exist. So I want to thank you. If you have any questions, just email me and then we can talk about them. I want to thank you for being here. And now I can look at questions for the last 1 or 2 minutes, maybe. Let's have a look. So I have some questions. Let's have a look. Okay. Okay, so the slides are not changing, I think. I hope that went well. But I can send you the presentation that is promised. So one question I would say, are internal tasks supposed to be considered user stories too? That is very interesting. That is an interesting point. So for me personally, yeah. So you could, in theory, communicate that that internal tasks are user stories, but they always have to have value for your product. So, in my opinion, this value, the product you actually create, should have should have value to your product. So, if you have a support software, for example, and you want to create this, you want to create something in regards to this, then I think that user story with support would be fine. But if it's just a task, a maintenance task for your developer, then a user story would, in my opinion, not be fine because it does not add actual value to the software that you want to create. Okay, I think we're finished for now. Thank you so much. So if you have any more questions, feel free to email me and we will see us. I hope we will hear from each other. We will see us next time. And I hope you could take away some things that I did or that I showed you. So thank you so much for joining.